Hello, and welcome to Talks at Google. Today's person to talk to is Mr. Jonathan Safran Foer. Usually, people say this person needs no introduction, and then they fall into a long introduction. I will try to avoid this pitfall. So please, Mr. Jonathan Safran Foer. Good afternoon. I'll try to just go quickly a couple of questions on each and every book that you wrote over the years. And so the first one will definitely be Everything Is Illuminated, published in 2002. And it is definitely a fiction book, yet, as far as I understand, it is somewhat of an expansion of a thesis that you wrote beforehand. So my question is, in your view, how accurate is this book when it describes all the atrocities done by the Ukrainians while little help from the Germans? And how much would you like us as readers to treat it as really a true thing?
Well, thank you, first of all, for coming out. It's a very grave question to begin with.
Yeah. It's only gets worse. So.
Yeah, I feel like a little tonally out of my wheelhouse here. It started when I arrived. I had to pee very desperately, as you know, and I was medevaced to the men's room, and above the urinal is a document, and I literally couldn't tell if it was a joke or not. I think it was a joke. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Probably it's not a joke, but...
No, I think it was a joke. It was something about the difference between debugging something and some other word that I didn't understand the use of. And either, look, it was a joke one way or the other. Either it was an intentional joke or it was an accidental joke. I think it was an intentional joke about, like, here we are at the urinal and we're going to treat it like we might treat coding or something like that, if that's even a word that you guys use. Or it was an accidental joke in the sense that I am going to seriously ask you to think about something while you're peeing, which is entirely possible because there were disposable toothbrushes and there are a lot of suggestions that one might continue to think beyond the standard parameters of a workday here. In any case, you're asking me about tone and the tone in that book. And it is a work of fiction, and sometimes in fiction one has to, or one does, move away from a kind of journalistic truth to get toward an experiential truth. So if, my second book, for example, has a 9-year-old who does quite a bit of the narrating, if I were to go to a playground and take dictation from a 9-year-old, I would have an unassailably realistic portrait of a 9-year-old, a journalistically accurate one. But if you were to then read that, you might think either this is boring, or it just doesn't sound like a 9-year-old to me. And it's one of the strange things and it's something that perhaps you guys wrestle with in your own ways, like the difference between something being true and feeling true, or the difference between information and substance. Yeah. And so I'm trying to create, as a novelist, a substance that imparts feeling, that provokes ideas, and that offers an experience that is beyond the kind of scientific account, let's say. That having been said, there are, and I'm willing to depart from the scientific or journalistic account in order to make it feel a certain way, most of the time, but there are some times when I'm not, when I want to be faithful to history, for example. And so in the case of that book, I did want to be faithful to history. And especially, I would have, even if it weren't personal history, but it happened to be personal history. And so that was one of the, responsibilities or burdens that I felt.
Interestingly enough, something like 3 years after the publishing of the book, it came out as a film as well. So I'm wondering, were you involved in any way in the film, and did you like it, or what was your opinion on what was going on there?
I was only barely involved. I came to know the writer and director, the same person, quite well. We became very good friends, and so my involvement was more as a friend than as a collaborator in the project. And I did like it. I was very, very grateful that it was made, because the scale of film, the scale of screens, dwarfs the scale of paper. And you know, whether that makes a writer happy or sad is a separate conversation, perhaps. But it definitely makes a writer happy when the world of screens is brought into the world of paper. And so having an adaptation, a film adaptation made of your book is the best thing that can happen to a book, short of Oprah liking it. But that's its own screen. I mean, she's big because she's on the screen.
Okay, so let's move forward 3 years later into this book that probably everyone in the world has read at least once. And if you haven't, you should feel very shameful. This book, and again, in a way similar to what happened in the first book and also in the newest book, revolve around major catastrophes or all kinds of atrocious things that happen. And I was wondering, why does it happen in your books?
Well, I mean, I would say the same thing about the days of my life as I would about my books. You know, when was the last time you turned on the news and there wasn't, if not a catastrophe, then a tragedy, you know, to give you pause and also to make you reflect on yourself, you know, both in terms of the scales of your domestic or personal tragedies or catastrophes when compared to or in the context of what's going on in the world, and the various ways that we can become confused about scale. That's something that happens with the characters in this book, Here I Am, quite often. A confusion of, you know, when there is a Syrian boy washed up on the beach, what am I then to do with the kind of passive-aggressive exchange I had with my wife the night before? Dismiss it entirely, or go back into it because of a, you know, gratefulness for being alive and wanting to do as much as I can, you know, with my life, knowing what I know about the horrors of life. So in each of my books, and including the nonfiction book, which you didn't mention, Eating Animals, about factory farming, there are these like horrors that force characters to make decisions. And I guess I have been interested in the ways that, you know, people walk around with all kinds of ideas of who they are, the things we think we're thinking about or think we're feeling, which are often just expressions of how we want to think of ourselves, or who we want to be, or how we want other people to think of us. And it takes often a crisis to reveal who we actually are.
Okay, so again, going back to really this book, I remember again, from my personal experience, I read it more or less when it came out, and I was feeling again, I was 90% immersed in what was going in the book and 10% amazed at how good this book is. But when I reached page 269 in my version, there was this, probably again, you might remember it, there's 3 pages of numbers, of digits. And I wouldn't start reading it, I don't want to bore you, but it starts with 69, 62, 63. And this is the dial tone of this grandfather who doesn't speak, and he uses the dial tone to communicate. And I remember, again, my friend and I trying, of course, to decipher it. So we were sitting there and said, okay, we wouldn't use any software because you probably wouldn't like us to use one. So we sat there and tried reading, and we managed to go something like, I don't know, 4 or 5 lines. And I said, oh, probably this is enough. But I was wondering, first of all, again, nobody is listening. Can you tell us what's in there? Does it really become random at some point, or can we read it the entire thing? What's going on there?
Who can remember? I mean, I wrote that so long ago. I have
Would you like me to read it to you? Maybe you
almost
remember.
no memory
6,
of it.
4.
Yeah. You know, it is what it is. What I can say is the point of it is not to decipher it. The point of it is a kind of expression of just frustrated communication.
Yeah.
And that is true in everything Is Illuminated. You know, the kind of hero of the book, although there's somebody who's named the hero, but the actual hero of the book is Alex, this young Ukrainian, who is a frustrated communicator in a pretty extreme way. He speaks in this stilted, very jarring English. And then there's frustrated communication throughout, extremely loud, and that's maybe the best example of it. Yeah. And then also in Here I Am, characters who, you know, have secret languages between them, or who them secretly know languages, and people who are unable to express themselves but in certain contexts and venues, like the son, one of the sons, Sam, who's 12 years old, who spends almost all of his time playing this Second Life kind of game called Other Life, which has its own unique language of interacting, and then the husband and wife who have their own sort of, again, secret language, like code words for things that each knows means something else. When the kids are in the back seat, sometimes they will spell out their conversations so the kids can't understand them. I guess it's not a coincidence that someone who devotes himself to language would question the effectiveness of language, maybe more than other people would. And I think that is one example of many of my playing out that questioning through story.
Okay. So you want to tell me the real answer offline while nobody's really listening?
I just told you the real answer. I told you the real question, maybe.
Yeah, probably so. And by the way, this book was turned into a movie as well. So what do you think is appealing in your books to directors?
Well, it's like, you know, there are people on Earth who have been struck by lightning twice, and to ask them, what do you think is appealing about you? Maybe you have a mouthful of cavities or something, or you just happen to walk in, you know, near the ocean during thunderstorms. I just got very lucky. I actually don't think there's anything that is particularly appealing about the books, in the sense of being ripe for adaptation. It just happened. I don't really know why, but I'm grateful that it did.
Yeah. Okay, so we're moving 5 years later from a book that everybody read to a book that I don't know how many people read. It's called The Tree of Codes, this one. Again, I had a hard time even getting a copy of it due to the fact that maybe not too many people read it or read about it. Would you like just to tell us a tiny bit of what made you do it, and how do you imagine a reader handling this piece of art, whatever you call it? So.
Well, handling is the perfect word, because it's a book that's meant to be handled. If you found it on Amazon, what you didn't find is a Kindle version of it, an ebook version. I was approached by I got a phone call one day. I remember exactly where I was. And I was in my office. I was trying to write a novel. And I got a phone call from somebody who said, I'm starting a publishing house in England, and we're going to do these kind of literary visual crossover books, art books. I can't give you an advance. I can't promise good distribution. We're not going to market the book, but I can make any book you want to make. And there's something about that just, I don't know if I wanted to challenge her certainty that, you know, we can make anything you want to make, or if I just found it to be a really appealing invitation. But we started to work together, and we came up with this idea. It might be worth holding it up and showing people, because it's easy to understand when you see it, but it's very hard to understand when it's described. So I took a book that already existed, which was Bruno Schulz's Street of Crocodiles. I don't know if you can see. And I had die cut out of the book words, so that the words that remain tell a completely different story. If you haven't heard of it, it's because what she said was true. We're not going to distribute it very well. They didn't. It was a hard book to make, a very hard book to make. There's actually a great video you can find on YouTube, I think, of the production of the book, which is a kind of pleasure in and of itself. But they didn't print a huge number of them, and that's it.
So again, and I saw in one of the interviews that your one of the statements which struck me as really interesting was, this is a book that remembers it has a body. So again, would you like to elaborate?
Well, I actually didn't say that. It was the artist Olafur Eliasson who said that as a blurb for the book. But I think he meant that we often forget that books are things, are artifacts, and that they have qualities. Like the margins in the page are a quality, the font is a quality, the cover, of course, is a quality, the way books smell is a quality. The heft of a book when you're in bed or in a bathtub or on the sofa is a quality. And ebooks, great as they can be for certain things, lack all of those qualities, or at least they're diminished. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question in life. Like, what do we get in exchange for the loss of qualities? Because we're increasingly living in a world without qualities, and some of them seem awfully benign or silly even to mention, like phones don't have buttons anymore. There are representations of buttons on a screen. Buttons have qualities. They make a clicking sound sometimes. Sometimes they put up a little bit of resistance. Sometimes they make each letter feel a little bit more individualized than a virtual keyboard. So those may not matter at all. Those examples probably don't matter. But man, are there a lot of examples. And I'm sure or I hope that's something that you guys wrestle with all the time as you create like the future of human experience and human thought and human culture. Like, who is remembering qualities? It's clear who's remembering expediency. It's clear who's remembering profitability. It's clear who's remembering the significance of information, or at least the significance of collecting information, but who is remembering qualities? Because I would bet to just about the last person in this room, qualities are what make us feel human. Like, quality is what makes love love. It's what makes fear fear, and makes hope hope. I wouldn't want to forget about those.
Yeah. By the way, an interesting thing that happened to me with this book was that preparing for this interview, I talked with my kids and I told them about this book, and I thought I would amaze them, and never seen such a thing before. And they told me, oh, on 3rd grade, we did such things. So I wonder if you started a trend here that every school, elementary school...
It resembles a children's book in a lot of ways. I mean, children's books are wonderful objects, oftentimes, like pop-up books.
Yeah.
Or they have... It's kind of amazing, actually. And a novel might now cost $30 in a bookstore. And if you go to the children's book section for like $6, you can get a book that has like all of these, like full color and things that come out and they make noises, and they can be really, really wonderfully, wonderfully inventive.
If we talked about movies for the previous books, this one was adapted into a ballet. What's the story behind it? How can it be?
So actually, the artist I mentioned, Olafur Eliasson, who said that thing about the book having a body, he collaborated with a choreographer, Wayne McGregor, and a musician, the XX, that band, Jamie XX, and they made a ballet, which was really quite a spectacle, pretty amazing. What did it have to do with the book? Not a lot. I think that they were inspired by the idea of layers and layering and like creating content by removing content, like when the absence becomes the positive rather than the negative, and that idea was a starting point. But it's not as if they tried to convey the story that the book tells in a different form.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now we are moving to 2016. And by the way, as a promotion for this new book, they said the first book in 11 years, as if this one did not exist. So I was wondering.
Well, not to mention the book we haven't talked about, which is Eating Animals, which is a nonfiction book, which I actually spoke about at the Google campus in wherever it is, California. I don't even know.
Mountain View. Yeah.
Mountain View. Yeah. I spoke about it there. I had a really wonderful conversation, I happen to remember, with the person who ran the food system there, the chef, I guess it is. Mm-hmm. I don't know if she's still there or not. I just happened to remember we had half an hour before, and incredibly thoughtful person, and it turned out to be like one of my favorite conversations of that book tour.
Yeah. So anyway, again, I assume that maybe not everyone read Here I Am. So would you like maybe to read a short excerpt from this book?
I can. I think that's a very safe assumption, by the way, that not everybody has read this book. If they had, man, I wouldn't even bother showing up to stuff like this. No, that's a joke, obviously.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I can read, sure.
Thank you.
I have a little thing I could do, which I was just thinking about recently. So the book takes place in Washington, D.C., where I grew up, over the course of about 6 weeks. And we follow a family through 2 crises, one of which is domestic, which is a discovered cell phone that reveals an affair, and the other is global. There's an earthquake which precipitates a war in the Middle East that's so extreme that the Prime Minister of Israel asks Jews to come back, in his words, come back to Israel to fight for its survival. But a lot of the book just takes place in Washington, inside this house, inside of kitchens and bedrooms and living rooms, as these family members interact with each other. So we have Jacob and Julia, are the married couple, 3 sons, Sam, Max, and Benji, who are 12, 10, and 6. So I'm just going to read a very short scene. It's 2 pages, but it's almost all dialogue, where the book opens with Sam, the 12-year-old, having gotten in trouble in school because there was a piece of paper found on his desk with a list of totally inappropriate words: racist, misogynistic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, sexually lewd, just all the bad words you could think of. And there's a question of, did he actually do anything wrong? I mean, he didn't direct them at anybody. They don't seem to refer to anything other than themselves. Jacob, that evening, goes into Sam's room, sort of have a conversation with him about it, and particularly his use of the N-word, which is the only word that's never actually articulated between 2 people, but always referred to. Sam is now explaining, well, he couldn't possibly be racist because his girlfriend is black. Okay? So he says, Dad, Billy's black, so how could I be a racist? Billy? The girl I'm in love with. You have a girlfriend? No. So then I'm confused. I said, she's the girl that I'm in love with. Okay, and you said Billy, but a girl, right? Yes, and she's black, so how could I be racist? Well, I'm not sure that logic quite works. It does, Sam said. And his dad said, well, you know who points out that some of his best friends are black, right? Somebody who isn't comfortable with black people. And Sam said, and for whatever it's worth, and Sam says, none of my best friends are black. His father says, and for whatever it's worth, I'm pretty sure that African American is the preferred nomenclature. Nomenclature? Terminology. Well, shouldn't the guy who's in love with a black girl be the one establishing the nomenclature? And Jacob, the father, said, isn't that the pot calling the kettle African American? Pot? Look, I'm just joking around. It's an interesting name, that's all, not a judgment. You know that you were named for a great-great-uncle who perished in Birkenau. With Jews, there always has to be some significance attached. Some suffering, you mean? You know, Gentiles just pick names that sound nice, or they even make them up. Billy was named after Billie Holiday, Sam said. All right, so fine, she's the exception that proves the rule. Who are you named after? Sam asked, his interest a small concession in response to the guilt of having forced his dad's voice into quiet sadness earlier. I was named for a distant relative, Yaakov, supposedly an amazing, larger-than-life guy. Story goes he crushed a Cossack's head in his hand. Cool. Well, I'm obviously not strong like that. We don't even know any Cossacks. And at most, I'm the size of life. One of their stomachs grumbled, but neither knew whose. Well, Jacob said, bottom line, I think it's awesome that you have a girlfriend. She's not my girlfriend. Nomenclature strikes twice. I think it's awesome that you're in love. I'm not in love. I love her. Well, whatever's going on, this obviously stays between us. You can count on me. I've already talked to Mom about it. Really? When? I don't know, a couple weeks ago. Wait a minute, this is old news? Jacob stared at Sam's screen. Was this what drew Sam to it? Not the ability to be elsewhere, but to be nowhere. What did you tell her? Jacob asked. Who? Your mother. You mean Mom? Yeah, that's the one. I don't know. You don't know as in you don't feel like talking about it with me right now? Yeah, as in that. It's strange because she's convinced that you did write those words. I didn't, Sam said. Okay, I'm becoming annoying. I'll get out of here. I didn't say you were annoying. Jacob moved to the door to leave, but then paused. You want to hear a joke? No, Sam said. It's dirty. Then definitely no. All right, what's the difference between a Subaru and an erection? No means no, Dad. No, seriously, what's the difference? No, seriously, not interested. Jacob leaned forward and whispered, I don't have a Subaru. Despite himself, Sam released a huge laugh, the kind involving snorting and saliva, and Jacob laughed, not at his own joke, but at his son's laughter. They laughed together, vigorously, hysterically. Sam struggled without success to regain his composure and said, the funny thing, the really funny thing, is you do have a Subaru. And then they laughed more, and Jacob spit a little and teared up, and remembered how horrible it was to be Sam's age, how painful and unfair. It's true, Jacob said. I totally have a Subaru. I should have said Toyota. What was I thinking? What were you thinking? What was he thinking? Stop there.
After I read this book again, it was when it came out in hardback. There was kind of a very strange rhyming event for me because I was driving in my car almost a few days after I finished reading it, and I heard over the radio a new Leonard Cohen song, just called "You Want It Darker." I guess you know it. Again, I just read the first couple of lines. It said, "If you are the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you are the healer, it means I'm broken and lame. If thine is the glory, then mine must be the shame. You want it darker, we kill the flame." And then he comes to the chorus and he said, "Hineni, Hineni, I'm ready, my Lord. Hineni, I'm ready. Here I am in Hebrew." And again, I was wondering, is this kind of magic, or what would you read into this kind of thing? The two very important artists came up with this importance of using Hineni or Here I Am as part of whatever they're doing that moment.
Well, it's not only Hineni, Here I Am, it's also I'm ready, as you just said, which are the last two words of this book, and have a huge significance as the last two words. It's just a total coincidence. I mean, things can be sort of culturally in the air, or magically was the word you used, and it's not a bad word. But it's not magical in the sense that it defies explanation. It's just magical in the sense that the explanation is so wonderful, that there's a kind of something like a collective consciousness. There are ideas that people have independently and powerfully. And the reality is that this is happening all the time. It's just that we only get to witness it every now and again. Yeah. That things that seem like profound coincidences really aren't. It's just that the ability to be present when they're happening is rare, but their occurrence in and of itself is not that rare. There's also, at the exact same time, in the TV show Transparent, which I really love, there was an episode in which Hineni and Here I Am also took on a great significance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe I'll stop here, and if anyone in the audience has some questions to you as well, then this might be a good time.
So to go back earlier when you were talking about the art project book, and you mentioned that you'd hope that we would be mindful of the qualities that we're losing as we move to, other forms of media. It seems to me also that there are a lot of qualities that we gain, like all the qualities that you listed having to do with books that you said were trivial, were things that were not present, when stories were just transmitted orally. And I wonder if you do you feel like there's a net loss, or do you think it's just the qualities that we gain by going to ebooks or whatever else?
I'm definitely not making the argument that technology leads to less qualities necessarily, but it's something that's worth thinking about. That was my only point. In the specific case of going from a paper book to an ebook, presently, I don't know what an ebook offers beyond the obvious things, which are like wonderful convenience, which is great. And it gives one the ability to carry many books at the same time, or to have access to books that you wouldn't necessarily have in a bookstore. And those are wonderful things. But in terms of the reading experience, I don't find the quality of reading a book on a screen to be as rich as reading a book. That having been said, the ebook experience is obviously going to change in the coming years. And because of that, the nature of books will change. And there will be the expectation to have all kinds of ancillary material, and that you'll be able to link to the author talking about why he or she made a decision in a certain point. Or you'll be able to, I assume one can already do this, I just don't really swim in that water, but you could click on a line that you are sure is an allusion to something, and then open, Shakespeare will open up, or Faulkner, or whatever it was. So I get frustrated when people talk about the inherent good or the inherent bad of technology. It's just such an oversimplification, and it's naive, and it's unproductive. But I also get frustrated when there isn't an honest and robust conversation about what it is that we're losing as we are gaining these things. As somebody said to me the other day, technology now runs the risk of answering questions it doesn't ask. And there are massive changes afoot in terms of what it is to be a human being and how we relate to each other. And I'm so grateful for a lot of the things that, is that true? Am I so grateful? Maybe I'm not. I don't know. But I'm not dismissive of the new ways of communicating with other people. I think there probably are examples in which it makes me feel more human, as opposed to simply presenting the illusion of offering more time, which it does not do. But what I don't think that there are broad ways of together asking questions about not simply what is efficient and not simply what is attractive in a short-term sense, but what is good. And it's a very basic question. We were saying earlier, Google has had the mantra, as this is again to like an outsider and a layperson, of what is it? Do no evil, or don't be evil. Don't be evil. That's an awfully low bar to clear. There is another question to be asked, which is what would it mean to do good? And to think very deliberately about what is there a difference in quality of thought? Is one kind of thought better than another kind of thought that makes us feel? I don't want anybody to be the arbiter of that question, but we are living in a world in which there are arbiters of such questions. Google and Facebook and Twitter, they are the arbiters of how should humans think? Because the form doesn't predetermine or dictate, but it strongly influences the kinds of interactions that we have and the kinds of thoughts that we have. And it's nice to imagine that the goodness of the quality of those thoughts is something that is as seriously considered as any other question.
9/11 is a pretty big topic to take on, since for many of us, it looms large in our recent memory. We're in college or wherever we were. Many of us were living it when it happened. Did this feel like a big challenge for you to take on such a big topic? Did you decide, I want to write a 9/11 book, and then the characters came out of that, or vice versa? Can you just say anything about that kind of the topic as it fit into your writing process?
It was a very difficult thing to write about. I was helped by the fact that I didn't know I was writing about it. I find that I'm able to, if I were to know what I was doing in advance of trying to do it, most of the things that I write about I just wouldn't do. And a lot of my writing is the result of a very open process that isn't outcome-oriented. I'm not trying to write a book about anything in particular. I never find a voice that I want to share. There are never characters living inside of me. There's not a story that I'm burning to tell. It's a very open process, open to intuitions, open to distractions, open to my changing self and the changing world. Most writers require 2 years to write a book, or 3 years. You change over that period of time, and the world changes. And I would never want to be in the position of responding or being enslaved to what seemed like a good idea had by somebody that I no longer am in a world that we no longer live in. So I like books to bend. In the case of Extremely Loud, I literally didn't know that I was writing about September 11th for quite a long time. I'd had this boy, Oscar, whose father died somehow, tragically, somehow, very suddenly. And he had a lot of the same characteristics and phobias that he has now. He used imagination in a lot of the same ways. And I actually gave the book to my little brother, who said to me, "Is it possible you're writing about September 11th?" Something that, there's a certain quality of idea that once you hear it, it becomes so obvious, but before hearing it, you never would have had it yourself. And that was such an idea. But all writing is hard. I find it's all difficult. And the idea of taking on a challenging subject, consciously or not, what else would you be doing? Why wouldn't you be trying to approach the big concerns? A big concern doesn't have to be a big historical concern, and doesn't have to be tragic. Like, humor can just as powerfully address the big concerns. But it's always tough. I have a friend who is a writer, who's no longer alive, unfortunately, who used to say, writing is like pulling teeth out of your penis. Like, it's as tough as it comes. For somebody who believes that writing has the ability to organize one's thoughts and feelings, and the ability to organize them in a way that they can be shared, well, that's a big tool to have. And so, you wouldn't want to use like the proton collider. Is that what it's called? The electron collider? What is it?
Collider definitely is in there.
Yeah. Yes, and it's probably in Switzerland. But if I could run back to the men's room, I'm sure there's an explanation of it above the urinal. But you wouldn't want to use that to like scramble eggs. That would be a stupid use of an amazing tool. The novel is an amazing tool and should be used in a way that befits its potential.
I think I have two questions. One's easy, and then one I haven't figured out how to ask. The easy one kind of relates to the question asked about making the movies. I listened to Here I Am as an audiobook and wondered to what extent you had any involvement in that, if you've heard it, if you enjoyed it. I really thought the narrator did a fabulous job and was a good way to enjoy the book.
So we'll answer that while you think about your second one. I haven't heard it. I haven't, because I have a kind of resistance to it, not in the sense that I'm worried about its quality. I've actually heard only good things about it, and I'm grateful for the person who did it. But it would be awkward for me to listen to, in much the same way that listening to your voice on an answering machine is awkward, just multiplied by 100 million. I've heard really funny stories of people who are listening to the audiobook, they're bopping around in their convertible or with the windows down, it's a nice day, come to a red light, cars on the left, cars on the right, and then it gets to the part about, there's some pretty sexually explicit stuff in this book, stuff where I very deliberately wrote the crudest thing I could conceive of, because it had to be for the context, because it's examining the power of language, examining the relationship between words and action. And also it had to be something that there was no way for Jacob, the husband, to be able to say, like, well, it's not what it seems. It had to be undeniably awful. And so I've heard stories of people who are reading a book, and those things come out of the blue. They're not contextualized in the beginning. Reading the book, and then all of a sudden it's, you can imagine.
It was actually the first thing.
You needed to imagine. I'm
there.
happy to talk about it.
When I saw the pile there, I wanted to see the physical copy so that I could see how it was presented in the book, because I remember it being jarring in the car, especially until the story kind of evolved to interpret what was going on.
Yeah, it's in the book, it's these sexting sentences that are taken out of context, but in the book they're removed from the body of the text by a space, and they're centered, and they're in italics. So when you read it, there's no question that you're reading something that is out of context. And I've wondered how a voice would accomplish that. Do you want to try to imitate it?
It's not safe for work. The harder question was, and I wish I could think of specific examples, but there are certain, I don't know, either paragraphs or sentences or phrases or concepts that seem almost as if they're poetic, or they're within the context of the book. And I wonder if it's things you collect over time, thoughts you have just as you live your life, and it's time to present them in a book, or if as you're writing and, I don't know, in the flow of telling your story or thinking about it, the things I'm referring to as maybe like scrapbook pieces that, important thoughts that you've had are coming to you in line as you create the book, or if they're things you've wanted to say and here's an opportunity to say so even if that wasn't where you imagined them showing up.
That's a really wonderful question, and I'm not even sure I know the answer exactly. I can tell you a little bit about how I write in the course of each day, which may be my best way of answering that. So when I face the blank page or screen, I devote the beginning of each day to a kind of almost like free associative thought. So I will sit down and just ask myself, is there something I'm thinking about right now? Is there anything on my mind? And I might literally look around the room and just, does anything here capture my imagination right now? And it's not the case that, it's not a judgment of the thing. It's a judgment of my imagination in that moment, It's not even a judgment at all. It's just a description of it. So like right now, I could look around the room and think like these, lighting doesn't really do anything for me. The exit sign that's illuminated, kind of interesting. Maybe I'll come back to that. Like these chairs, a globe. So anyway, I would find something and just reflect on it and research it a little bit and write for like an hour or two about something that just captures my mind with absolutely no regard or concern for the outcome, if it's going to fit into what I'm working on, if it's useful. It's just I assume there is some good reason that I'm interested in something. It's a little bit like, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of getting into bed on like Friday night after a long day, at the end of a long week. You're really tired, the room is cold, the bed is warm, and you're about to drift off, and then you have a little idea, and you think, well, I could get out of bed and write it down, or I could just assume that it's not important, or I can assume that I'll remember it in the morning, but nobody ever, ever, ever remembers those ideas in the morning. So writing is the way I do it is a lot like getting out of bed. It's uncomfortable. It's not the easier way to do things. And I'm not at all sure that these thoughts are going to have any significance, but I know that I can't know unless I record them, and I'm able to reflect on them later. So I spend the first bit of every writing day doing that. Then I go back to the beginning of what I have been working on for the last stretch of time. So let's say a 50-page section, and I'll read it from the beginning, editing it while I read it. So I'm constantly editing what I work on. I don't make a draft and then a second draft and a third draft. It's like always combing over itself. And then at the end of the day, when I have maybe an hour left, I will look back at the thing from the beginning, at the globe or whatever it was, and think, is this interesting? Does this have anything to do with anything? Was it just a little piece of mental garbage that had to be disposed of, or is it relevant? And when I'm in the beginning of a book and I don't yet have a feeling for what it is, that stuff at the beginning of the day is almost always nothing. I can't use it. As I get to the end of a book, 4 days out of 5, it ends up becoming part of what I'm working on. I can think of so many explicit examples in this book. There's little meditations on contingency plans for asteroids approaching the Earth. There's a little meditation on sign language. There's a meditation on this Nirvana lyric. There's a meditation on the animals in the Museum of Natural History and why they're positioned in the ways that they are. Those were all the products of that early morning, I'm thinking about this thing right now. And then the realization that the part of the brain that you don't have control over is constantly at work and is constantly doing interesting work, as opposed to the part of the brain that I do have control over, which is eating a lot of popcorn and watching a lot of TV, and even when it is engaged, isn't that great. It's okay, but it's not that great. I would never be able to write something good on purpose. It always has to be because I have learned through lots of experience and lots of effort and will. It's not naive, but I've learned how to get in the way of those kind of interesting accidents and how to move the light toward my intuitions.
So I've read a number of your books. Eating Animals is one of them, and albeit 7 years ago. But from what I remember, you touch a little bit upon like this forgetfulness that happens when there's a lack of transparency into something, and that's obvious. Transparency is a really interesting topic, especially in the tech space at both extremes. And so I'm wondering, A, what your thoughts are on that, and B, if you might have another nonfiction book in the works that also touch, or if you were particularly attached to the animal topic, or if you're really interested in sort of the meta topics.
That's another really great question. For a long time, I've wanted to write a book about technology, actually, and in a way that's very similar to Eating Animals, that I've had these instincts about it, and they seem to fluctuate in really extreme ways, and they're based in not a lot of familiarity with how the world actually works and what's actually going on. And with Eating Animals, it wasn't until, and I've gone through, I went, for most of my life, I was sometimes a vegetarian, sometimes I would eat everything, sometimes I was a vegan, sometimes I was a pescatarian, just all over the map. I've had periods when I will leave my phone in a drawer, for as much of the day as possible, or leave my phone in the drawer when I'm in my house with family. I don't use any social media, but I could also easily imagine becoming deeply immersed in it. I'm somebody who's flailing in his relationship to technology, just as I flailed in my relationship to food. It was when I had kids and had to start making choices on their behalf, because every parent does. It's not like you force vegetarianism on your kids any more than you force meat eating on your kids. You just force a familial culture on your kids. That is what it is to be a parent. And similarly, I now have to give some really serious thought to what kind of role technology will play in their lives. And I'd like for it to be thoughtful, not the kind of thought that is just following the current of whatever everybody else is doing, or the current of what is easy, but that where my actions are in some kind of correspondence with my beliefs. As I was saying earlier, as with the food industry, I think everybody feels a little bit of discomfort with regard to meat. Anthony Bourdain feels a little discomfort with regard to meat. We've had conversations about it. He's actually an incredibly thoughtful person about it. It's just he distinguishes between factory farming and traditional and family farming, which I think is an extremely important distinction to make that a lot of people don't know about or think about. I think also there's a broad discomfort about technology. I don't know any parents who have a perfectly laissez-faire attitude about technology when it comes to their kids. And frankly, I don't know all that many people who have a perfectly laissez-faire attitude about their own use. If I had a nickel for every time somebody has said to me, I wish I used my phone less, I wish I checked email less, I wish I were less reliant on screens. Not that I wish I didn't have them in my life. That's not what I mean. And these are people who love the technology that they have and value it in ways that I think are really rich and deep. But a discomfort, that's all, a discomfort. And it's a discomfort that I at least haven't devoted nearly enough of myself to and want to, especially as the influence of technology in our lives is becoming something that is not only more profound but harder to negotiate. As the range of choices seems to be becoming smaller and smaller.
I was wondering about, I remember there was a scene in Extremely Loud where Oscar discovers the pen in the pen store where it's written in a different color. And that's one of those things that just has stuck with me. I go and I look at pens and it's just wouldn't it be funny to write a different color? Is that one of those things that was an early morning kind of thing, or is that one of those things that kind of floats through the air and then you remember it for a long time, kind of looking for a way to weave that into a story? Because that seems
That's a great question. So he's referring to the phenomenon of anybody who's ever been to an office supply store where there's a little pad of paper where people can test pens. They very often write the name of the color of the pen that they're writing with. And that ends up being a kind of clue or an oddity that Oscar notices. that was something that struck me. So there's like a whole category of things that just strike me as interesting metaphors without my knowing what they're metaphors for. Those to me are the most richest kind of metaphors. Like, this has something to do with life, and I don't know what. If I know what it is, then it's a little bit mundane, or it exhausts itself. And if I don't trust that it has anything to do with anything, then it's just empty. But there's something in between where you don't have, like, you're not able to grasp the meaning, but you know that it's there. And that's a really deep experience to have as a writer or a reader or just a person moving through the world. I write scenes around those feelings. So you might have read that scene and thought, okay, so he has Oscar doing this, and then he was thinking about a stationery store, and he had that realization. In fact, I wrote the whole stationery store scene because I had that idea. Another example, actually, is it the cover of this? Can I see that extremely loud?
Sure.
Well, it's not exactly. There's an image in the book that this is an excerpt from. It's right here. It's in the beginning. This, okay? So this kind of photo takes on some significance in the book. There's a 2-page spread of it. The first book I ever did, which we didn't talk about, was an anthology about the artist Joseph Cornell. The publisher paid me for that book. It was an art book publisher in art books. So I had like a huge credit, and every season they would send me the catalog of their books, and I would pick out the ones that I liked, and they would send them to me, and that was how we worked off the advance. In one of those catalogs, this was the cover of a book called, I think, The Birdman of Brooklyn. I think so. I just became entranced by that cover. I said I'd like to order that book, and they said, we're actually not publishing it. I can't remember what had happened. There's some problem. And yet I'd seen the image, and then I got in touch with the photographer who I befriended. And then I wrote the scene for the book as a way of using that image. And it's the scene in which the title, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close, appears, the only time in the book. And it's because of this, I mean, talk about like the process of openness and fortuity. There's a wonderful saying that the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky said, the rhyme is smarter than the poet. You know, people write in verse because it's pretty, but also because it creates a problem. And the solution to the problem is more interesting than what you would have done if you had not been constrained. I would never have arrived at the title, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. I would never have had the scene where Oscar goes and visits the guy, you know, I mean, with the hearing aid, turning the hearing aid up, if I hadn't come across this thing, which, in a way, my attraction to that image presented a problem, which is how can I use that? And the solution to it was, in many ways, this book. And just to return to a theme that has come up now, I know we have to end, but in addition to, like, where are the qualities, where are the problems? Like, we're living in a world that's solving all of our problems for us. Is there anything richer than getting, it's frustrating, it's annoying, and it is to be avoided. But how many good things have been stumbled upon when you get lost? You know, like the most memorable experiences that I have had as a driver, virtually all of them are either because I was lost or because I created my own route. And in the process of creating it, became aware of possibilities, you know? Like, oh God, I've always meant to go to that place. Or, you gotta be kidding me, there's a town with this bizarre name. I have to have a picture of myself at the, you know? And it is something else that I give a lot of thought to because so much of my creative life is dependent upon the accidental thing, which is stumbled upon, which I commit myself to exploring, and to being in response to. You know, not that the accidents in the world is not in the service of me, of facilitating the world so that it's better organized for my ends, but that I can be also in the service of those, you know, wonderful stumbled upon things.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.